Good evening. Today is April 25th, 2015. I'm sorry, 2025. You're 10 years behind. Uh, April 25th, 2025. And I want to recall the month of April 1975. That's 50 years ago. That was a very important month in history. Let's look over some of the major events that made the news. It was on Tuesday, April 1st, 1975, the American Freedom Train began its tour of the United States in the celebration of the U.S. bicentennial, starting with a display in Wilmington, Delaware, then proceeding westward. After reaching San Diego on January 14th of 1976, the train began its return trip, stopping in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania on July 4th, 1976. That was the day of the bicentennial, a Sunday. They finished its tour in Miami on December 31st of that year. And all 7 million visitors would see the train and its exhibits. Now, on Friday, April 4th, Bill Gates and Paul Allen incorporated Microsoft Incorporated in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And then on the same day, for the first time since the 1973 War Powers resolutions had taken effect, an American president delivered the required report to Congress about military action. President Gerald Ford advised of his sending of U.S. Marines, ships, and helicopters to evacuate refugees from South Vietnam. And it's been done a number of times since then. That particular law was passed on November 7th of 1973. It was passed over the veto of President Richard Nixon. It was on Tuesday, April the 8th, that Josephine Baker, the famous African-American dancer who had established residence in France in protest to American racism, she danced before a crowd of celebrities at the Bobino Theater in Paris. Days later, she became who was a beloved citizen of France, had a cerebral hemorrhage and died on April the 12th at the age of 68. And on Wednesday, April the 9th, the Battle of Quan Loc, my pronunciation may not be right, took place. The South Vietnamese forces held out against superior North Vietnamese forces before finally withdrawing on April the 19th. It was on April the 14th, on Monday, the Federal Election Commission was created. It had been created on October 15, 1974, but on April 14, 1975, it began operations with the swearing in of 6 commissioners by President Ford. And then on April 15th, it was a Tuesday, the leftist government of Portugal nationalized most of the nation's basic industries and began land reform. Then on April the 16th, a Wednesday, Air Force Marshal Hosni Mubarak was named vice president of Egypt by President Anwar Sadat. And Mubarak would become president following Sadat's assassination on October the 6th, 1981. On April the 17th, 1975, a Thursday, former Texas Governor and U.S. Treasury Secretary John Connally was acquitted of all charges by a federal jury in a bribery trial in Washington. Connally had been wounded during the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, and then 10 years later he switched from Democrat to Republican following the death of his mentor, Democratic President Lyndon Baines Johnson. And he had been under consideration by Nixon to succeed Spiro Agnew when he resigned in 1973. but Gerald Ford ended up becoming vice president. Nixon probably knew that the Democrats in Congress considered John Connally to be a turncoat, and there's no way they were going to confirm him. A number of Democrats had visited with Nixon and told him, if you nominate Jerry Ford, we'll confirm him, and he was a safe choice. On April 18th, a Friday, the 200th anniversary of the midnight ride of Paul Revere, um, was observed in Boston's North End neighborhood. President Ford visited the Old North Church, where two signal lanterns had been placed on April 18, 1775. He lit a third lamp to symbolize the start of America's third century. Then on April 19th, South Vietnamese forces withdrew from the town of Quan Loc, as mentioned earlier. On April 21st, South Vietnam's President Nguyen Van Thieu resigned and fled the country to Taiwan 5 days later. And he later moved to London and finally Newton, Massachusetts, where he died on September 29, 2001. It was on April 21st of that year that the members of the Sabayanese Liberation Army, the SLA, had kidnapped newspaper heiress Patty Hearst on February 4th of 74. They robbed a branch of the Crocker National Bank in Carmichael, California. And on this occasion, a bystander, Myrna Afzal, a 42-year-old mother of four, was killed. And she had been at the bank depositing money collected by her church from the previous day's services. Hearst was later identified as the driver of the getaway car. And on April the 23rd, President Ford spoke at Tulane University in New Orleans. He announced that today America can regain the sense of pride that existed before Vietnam, but it cannot be achieved by fighting a war that is finished as far as America is concerned. He received a round of applause for those remarks. Earlier in the day, the U.S. Senate voted 75 to 17 to approve $250 million in humanitarian aid and the use of U.S. troops to evacuate South Vietnam, but they declined to take up Ford's request for any further military aid. Then on April the 25th, that was 50 years ago today, and it was also Friday, just like today is, it was exactly 1 year after the Coronation Revolution that toppled the dictatorship in Portugal. The first multi-party elections there in almost 50 years was conducted. There was a 91.7% turnout of eligible voters, and fears that a communist government would be voted into office in Western Europe were proven wrong. The Socialist Party, led by Mario Soares, won 116 of the 250 seats in the assembly, and Francisco de Sá Canero's Social Democrats won 81. Alvaro Cunhal and the Portuguese Communist Party obtained only 30 seats. Then on April 27th, Duong Van Minh was unanimously elected as president of South Vietnam by the National Assembly, authorized to negotiate a peace agreement with the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. He was called Big Man. He had replaced Tran Van Nguyen, and he had been vice president or two, but he didn't serve as president long. Now, then on April 29th, in Saigon, the order to carry out Operation Frequent Wind was received, commencing the evacuations of all Americans from South Vietnam, as well as South Vietnamese nationals who might face retaliation. 2 U.S. Marine security guards, Corporal Charles McMahon and Lance Corporal Darwin L. Judge, became the last American servicemen killed in Vietnam, the victims of North Vietnamese shelling at the airport. Their remains were inadvertently left behind and will be buried by the North Vietnamese at a Saigon cemetery. On February 22nd, 1976, the bodies of the two servicemen will be released back to American custody. The fall of Saigon took place the following day. That was Wednesday, April 30th, 1975. That effectively ended the Vietnam War. South Vietnamese President Dong Van Minh announced the surrender of the nation to the North Vietnamese invaders. I believe firmly in the reconciliation among Vietnamese to avoid unnecessary shedding of the blood of Vietnamese, said Minh. For this reason, I asked the soldiers of the Republic of Vietnam to cease hostilities in calm and to stay where they are. Shortly after this, the North Vietnamese tanks knocked down the Independence Palace gate. The Viet Cong flag was raised over a presidential palace at 12:15 p.m. and Minh was taken to a radio station to announce the government's surrender. Throughout the day in Saigon, soldiers discarded their military uniforms, and the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers occupied all of Saigon without resistance. Earlier in the day, U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin was the last American diplomat to leave Saigon, lifting off of the U.S. Embassy roof at 4:58 a.m. At 7:53 a.m., U.S. Marine Corps Colonel James Keane and 10 U.S. Marines left on an American helicopter, ending the U.S. presence in Vietnam. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and it was formally incorporated by the North as part of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam on July 2nd, 1976. So that was a very eventful month in history. I remember the month very well. At the time, I was living in Teague, Texas. I was had a job at the state of Texas, the Texas Department of Public Welfare, now known as the Texas Department of Human Resources. That was the best job I had, pay-wise and otherwise, up until that time. A job I dearly loved. I worked with the aged, blind, and disabled, visiting local nursing homes, and also arranging alternate care where aged and disabled persons could stay in their own homes as an alternative to nursing home placement. I got officially worked 40 hours a week, but sometimes it ended up being 50 or 60. I didn't mind. The caseload was not in good shape when I got it. It took a lot of work to get it up to par, and I did it. I thoroughly loved what I was doing. Had an apartment 2 blocks from my office. I had cases all over Freestone County. I was not married at the time. I was not pastoring a church. The main thing I had going was my job and my thesis. I had the previous year, in May of 1974, I had completed my coursework for my Master of Arts degree in Church State Studies at Baylor, and I had begun work on my master's thesis entitled The Nation of Islam, Belief and Practice in Light of the American Constitutional Principle of Religious Liberty, the Black Muslims, and a very interesting movement that I researched very thoroughly during that time. So I was going back to Waco a lot of times on weekends to do research at the Baylor Library for my thesis. I was staying very busy and very much enjoying it. On April the 13th, I made a major change, a denominational switch. I had been a Christian since 1965. I had been preaching since 1966, but I was a Baptist. In the fall of 1974, I met the late Reverend James R. Anderson, pastor of St. Paul AME Church in Waco. He invited me to come preach for him. And he said, I want to see if I can convert you over. Well, he succeeded. It was in the fall of 74. I preached at St. Paul for the first time. Then in the spring, then April 13th, 1975, I preached there for the second time. Reverend Anderson, Andy as we called him, was Um, he presented me with a baptismal certificate and a certificate of church membership because he knew what I was going to do. After I preached, I responded to my own invitation to join the church. And I became a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. That following week, I attended um, the district conference at Wade Chapel AME Church in Hillsboro. For the first time, I met Presiding Elder R.T. Thomas. The following Monday, 8 days after my um, joining the church, it was on Monday, April 21st, was the quarterly conference of St. Paul. I was licensed as a local preacher by Presiding Elder Thomas. Then the following fall, October 10th, I would be ordained as an itinerant deacon at the Central Texas Conference of the AME Church in Austin. I did not get a pastoral appointment the first year, but I did in 1976. My first charge was Emmanuel Dallas. And in October of 1977, I was ordained an itinerant elder. So I've been in the AME Church now 50 years. It's been quite a journey. And held other jobs with the state of Texas. I currently pastor Bethel AME Church in Corsicana, and I'm again working with the state of Texas as a chaplain with the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the Cofield unit near Palestine. It's been quite a journey. And so April 1975 was quite a year in history and quite a year in my life. Hope everybody has a good evening and a good weekend. May God bless all of you.